Imagine you're sitting in a room in Moscow, late at night. Not a TV studio, not a podium. A real room, maps on the wall, phones that never stop buzzing, reports stacking up faster than they can be read, and one line keeps reappearing. Not a new weapon, not a new base, a number. For years, NATO's magic number was 2%, a promise that sounded serious, but rarely felt dangerous. Now that number is moving to 5, and here's what Russia won't say out loud. This isn't about a single battle. It's about what happens after the first months, when ammunition matters more than speeches, when factories matter more than flags, because a NATO that can rearm for a decade isn't an alliance, it's a machine. So why is Moscow calling it irrelevant, while quietly behaving like the clock just started ticking? Here's what we're going to do in this video, so you know exactly where this is headed. First, we'll break down what 5% actually means, because it's not just buying more weapons. Then, we'll look at what NATO's rearmament really changes: ammunition, air defense, logistics, cyber, infrastructure, and industrial capacity. After that, we'll compare Russia's public message, "This doesn't scare us," with the signals Russia can't hide: spending, planning, and posture. And by the end, you'll have a clear answer to one question. If this is nothing, why is Moscow working so hard to convince everyone it's nothing? For years, 2% of GDP was NATO's magic number. It was repeated like a ritual. Spend 2% and you're doing your part. But 2% was never a guarantee of readiness. It was a political signal. You can spend 2% badly. You can spend it slowly. You can spend it on paper and still have empty stockpiles, thin maintenance, and factories that cannot surge. And Russia noticed, because Moscow's strategy has leaned on one brutal assumption: Europe talks, America carries. And if the shooting starts, the West runs out of ammunition before Russia runs out of will. Then came Ukraine. And suddenly, NATO wasn't just a treaty. It became a production problem, a question of whether the West could sustain a high-intensity war, not for weeks, but for years. In 2025, NATO moved from the old 2% world to a new target: 5% with a long runway into the 2030s. But 5% is not one simple pile of money. It's built like a two-part engine. First, a big core chunk for real military capability forces: equipment, training, readiness, and the things you actually fight with. Second, a supporting chunk for resilience, critical infrastructure, cyber defense, mobility, industrial capacity, and civil preparedness. And that second part matters more than most people realize. Because Russia doesn't fear NATO buying a few shiny platforms. Russia fears NATO building the system behind those platforms: the roads, the depots, the ports, the repair hubs, the secure networks, the supply chains, the boring stuff that turns peacetime armies into wartime machines. This is not only about more spending, it's about making spending usable and making it usable fast. If you want to understand why this scares Moscow, stop imagining military parades. Imagine spreadsheets, factory shifts, stockpiles, and logistics maps that stop looking fragile. Because rearmament in the modern era isn't just tanks, it's the pipeline behind the tank. 1. Munitions and mass Ukraine exposed a reality that military planners already knew, but politicians often ignored. High-intensity war burns through artillery shells, missiles, drones, spare parts, at a rate that makes peacetime planning look like a joke. A serious 5% pathway isn't just about new gear. It's about deep magazines and the ability to refill them. 2. Air and missile defense. Russia's modern playbook uses long-range strikes and saturation attacks. So if NATO scales layered air defense across Europe, the coercion toolkit shrinks because the cheap terror strategy becomes harder to pull off. 3. Mobility and infrastructure. Here's the part that changes everything. You can have a powerful army and still be slow. If NATO spends the next decade hardening its transport routes, ports, rail lines, bridges, roads, then reinforcement stops being theory. A brigade that can't move is not deterrence. A brigade that moves in days changes calculations. 4. Cyber and networks. Modern wars don't only happen on land, sea, and air. They happen on servers, satellites, cables, power grids, and resilient spending is about making sure the rear doesn't collapse when pressure rises. 5. The industrial base. This is the shadow war behind every war. Who can build faster, cheaper, and at scale? If Europe and North America shift into long-term production, munitions, drones, air defense interceptors, armored vehicles, spare parts, then the West becomes harder to exhaust. And that's the heart of this story. Russia doesn't fear NATO's weapons. Russia fears NATO's momentum. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive, subscribe, because in geopolitics, the real story is usually hidden in the details most people skip. And I want your take in the comments, because there are at least 3 ways to read this shift, and they don't all lead to the same conclusion. Which lens do you think matters most, and what should we cover next? Now let's talk about why this hits Russia differently than almost anything else. From Moscow's perspective, this isn't only rearmament. It's the rear coming alive. For years, Russia could look west and see fractures, different budgets, different politics, different readiness levels. Now, the direction is clearer, a decade-long push to harden Europe into something closer to a deep military base. And that creates 3 Russian nightmares. Nightmare 1, endurance. Russia's current posture is expensive, not sometimes expensive, wartime expensive. If NATO commits to long-term rearmament, Russia can no longer assume it will simply outlast the West's attention span. Because the moment Europe and North America prove they can keep building, year after year, Russia's leverage shrinks. Nightmare 2, depth. Russia can threaten borders, it can pressure neighbors, it can destabilize, but it struggles against depth, against an opponent with layers, factories, logistics, reinforcement routes, and alliance coordination. A more militarized Europe is strategic, depth made real. Nightmare 3, predictability. The more predictable NATO's investment path becomes, the harder it is for Russia to gamble on hesitation. Deterrence is not only capability, it's credibility. And sure, some governments will argue, delay, or complain, but Russia doesn't need every country to hit every benchmark perfectly. Russia only needs to believe the West is finally serious about scaling. So what does Moscow say? It frames NATO spending hikes as propaganda. It calls it militarization. It claims the West needs an enemy to justify budgets. And it often repeats one basic line: this doesn't threaten Russia. But here's the tell. When a government truly isn't worried, it doesn't need to repeat the message. It doesn't need to mock the plan. It doesn't need to insist the enemy is wasting money. It simply watches. Russia is not simply watching, because Russia understands something uncomfortable. Europe's biggest vulnerability isn't courage, it's political stamina. So Moscow's objective isn't only to prove NATO is weak. It's to make NATO tired, to make voters resent the cost, to make governments fight each other, to make rearmament feel pointless. That's what the information war is doing here. Not winning a debate, but winning time. Now, let's be honest. 5% is not a switch you flip. It's a redesign of budgets, taxes, and national priorities. Even if money is allocated, there's a second obstacle. Can countries actually absorb the spending? Can industry produce fast enough? Can militaries recruit? Can procurement systems move without wasting years? So yes, there will be friction. There will be inefficiency. There will be political backlash. But from Moscow's view, the terrifying part is not perfection. It's direction. The West is attempting to solve the hard problem, not how to look strong for a year, but how to stay strong for a decade. So, from 2% to 5%, on paper, it's a budget number. In reality, it's a message. NATO is trying to become a machine that doesn't run out of time. And that's why Russia downplays it. Because admitting fear would mean admitting something worse, that the war meant to weaken the West may have triggered the West's most dangerous response. Not rage, not revenge, but rearmament with a plan. If you want, comment below. Do you think NATO actually follows through over the next decade? Or does politics break the promise before the factories ever catch up? And if you want the next video in this same style, tell me what topic you'd like to see next.